ancient Greek theoretician Heraclitus of Ephesus famously gave to us his phrase, panta rei, everything flows. Because in his mind, the most accurate description of reality was one which emphasized a quality of becoming. Though historically running against the grain, such thinking has nonetheless resonated with many philosophers, now residing under the umbrella school of thought known as process philosophy. Poetically summed up by Heraclitus in his phrase, "The world is an ever-living fire." Fire, or more plainly put, change, is considered to be the principle of all things. So that if any system is to remain aligned with its own identity, its identity must equally flow along a course of change. And it's for this reason that his phrase, "into the same river it is not possible to step twice," refers just as much to the ceaseless changing of the river as it does to the ceaseless changing of the person who steps into it. But there is another interesting perspective that this philosophy opens up, one which feels veritably aligned with the picture that we have ourselves begun to unfold in the previous chapters, in that as everything plays its small part in this overarching entwined state of change, all things are connected. And as all things are connected, all things are in a state of complex unity. All is one. What Heraclitus described was a world where all objects came about as the result of opposing forces, where all things influence all things in a great dance of eternal becoming. Though again, just as with our own modern interpretations, this eternal state of change was itself dictated by the deeper, unchanging law. A law that enveloped all things into this holistic state of change and oneness. This is what Heraclitus referred to as the Logos, the fundamental way of nature, will, and the universe. But once again, as the true word of reality, this was itself impervious to any influence of change, since it was by its nature that the ever-flowing state of change existed in the first place. In this sense, the Logos was not only a description of the divine in its unity, but also a description of the endless cosmos in which the living fire was able to burn. Now, this is perhaps a curious thought for those of us who have spent our entire lives learning that we are individuals. Individuals made up of a unique collection of cells upon molecules, upon atoms, upon quarks, upon gluons, upon. As outlined in the first act of this series, our 21st century identity tends to be that which has arisen from a concept of things. We don't see ourselves as change, because we are merely things that change. Nevertheless, as contrary as this process theory may at first appear, it is not one wholly detached from our modern theories, as both impermanence and interconnectivity are majorly defining characteristics of modern quantum mechanics and relativity. And the fact that science exists at all is evidence in support of our belief that the nature of things is fundamentally interconnected. If something fails to make sense to us, we all assume, rather we believe, that there will always be an underlying answer awaiting discovery. But why does there have to be any such answer? It is our shared opinion that reality has this interrelated quality, and that it will always present itself as long as we are to seek it hard enough. One pioneer of process who found themselves in the crosshairs of the 20th century scientific revolution was philosopher and mathematician Alfred Whitehead. Though widely recognised for his later metaphysical works, Whitehead is more often praised for his early contributions to mathematics and his 3-volume essay Principia Mathematica, co-authored with his student, friend, philosopher, and fellow mathematician Bertrand Russell. Intended as a deep dive dissection of the logic fundamental to all mathematics, the authors were forced to take nothing for granted. Famously known for taking a trifling 360 pages to prove that 1 + 1 really does equal 2, not even the most basic aspects of number theory could be considered safe without first passing a rigorous test of logic. As such, Whitehead and Russell were both poignantly aware of just how easily one can fall victim to hidden assumptions when attempting to form logical conclusions. But it was through this process of dissecting logic that Whitehead came to realise his frustrations with the modern scientific paradigm and its substance-focused narrative. And at a time when even long-reigning religious views were beginning to nervously bolster up against the fortitude of the growing scientific narrative, Whitehead could see how the ultimate truth-seeking ideals of science were being undermined by the defensive stance of its worldviews, views that were being defended just as fervently as any expressed by the religious. How can any doctrine, thought Whitehead, consider itself ultimately investigative when it acts so pre-decidedly on so many issues? Whitehead greatly admired the ancients, commenting that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. But he was also able to recognise that something had been lost, that the modern scientific paradigm, in following the more rigid line of post-Galilean and Newtonian physics, had, to its detriment, oppressed much of history's accumulated wisdom, a wisdom that seemed to be once again relevant in the light of relativity and quantum mechanics. And so as many of Whitehead's contemporaries continued their endeavour to uncover the next bit from the universe's endless rabbit hole of bits, Whitehead, like Heraclitus, found himself rejecting this physicalist norm, allowing himself to appreciate a more controversial perspective of reality, the perspective of process. Considered to be one of the most comprehensive contributors to process philosophy, Whitehead required it of himself to devise an entire process relational ontology, which might be all well and good for Whitehead, but when an idea requires an entirely new language to describe it, well, one can probably expect a slow-burning response. Not only that, but his work was notoriously dense and filled with long and hard-to-follow passages. Nevertheless, I do feel it necessary, in context of our greater inquiry, that we take a few minutes to try and visualise his theory, as I believe it may prove helpful for later chapters. However, if you do wish to skip ahead, please feel free to jump forward to the next chapter marker, where I shall pick up our thread. Otherwise, I shall now attempt to condense his thinking into plain English as briefly and as best as I can. The physicalist description of the world suggests that our experience of things occurs when the brain provides us with a mental representation of the physical data received by the senses. But unlike the neurologist or physicist, Whitehead places the phenomena of experience not only at the head of these sense-related interactions, but at the seat of every interaction. Thus why Whitehead's particular version of process philosophy is often considered another example of panpsychism. As he says, each actuality is essentially bipolar, physical and mental. These actualities are to be thought of as event-like processes, which he considered to be, quote, the final real things of which the world is made up, end quote. Self-organized, relational happenings drops of experience, complex and independent, each guided by a particular subjective aim that culminates in a satisfaction of being. However, this subjective aim is not primarily intellectual, nor necessarily conscious. Instead, it is, as he says, the mere lure for feeling, the germ of mind, unique gradients of will that open up novel possibilities through a flux of creative freedoms. Depending on whether our description of these actualities require a spatial or temporal emphasis, they can either be called actual entities or actual occasions, but both refer to the same event-like entity. God is an actual entity, he says, and so is the most trivial puff of existence in far-off empty space. So you may be thinking, how are we supposed to superimpose this idea of actual entities onto the world we know? Well, firstly, we should try to understand his notion of the continuum and the process of concrescence, which is the act of tying one actual entity into its next. And then we shall see how these can unite as an ordered, self-sustained organism like you or me. Now again, these are not objects, but events, and as such, we can imagine how they could just as adequately be described as an uninterrupted continuum of flux, a web of relations, thick with the rich history of all past facts. But the point that Whitehead wants to elucidate is that these regions of facts can be considered both in terms of this becomingness of the continuum and also in a beingness specific to the goal intention of each entity. But it's only in respect of the pluralistic nature that we can discuss the activity of any particular actual entity. As an atomistic sea of relations, we can now speak of these actual entities in terms of their mereological relations, which ebb and flow in a coming and going of eternal influence, where the history of past facts gets passed on to each new generation, thus shaping that generation's private, subjective aim. And it's this process of interaction that he calls the concrescence, a point-free phasic process that doesn't happen in space or time, but rather results in space and time. And this is where we come back to you and I. Because we are not ourselves actual entities, but emergent processes. Like the emergence of time or space, can other equally complex processes emerge when a nexus of actual entities come together under a shared subjective aim, an ordered set called a society. And this is how Whitehead would describe us, a temporary identity that only endures due to the balance held between the collective's shared subjective aim and the character-defining qualities of our environment. But again, we are not the body, or even the subjectivity of our person. Rather, we as a society of event-like occasions are the historical root of that person from birth to death. Though it is in recognizing ourselves as a historically related series of events, rather than an ever-changing object, that we can now attach this same definition to more abstract entities, like the historical root of a language from its inception through to its loss, as both human and language are to be considered societies. This is why he states that the question as to whether to call an enduring object a transition of matter or of character is very much a verbal question as to where you draw the line between various properties. And it's in this same appreciation that a society can also be seen as part of a greater society, like its environment, such that an electron, as a society, is only a part of a greater set of electronic occasions, or a proton is a society of protonic occasions, which are equally parts of an electromagnetic society that's contained within a geometrical society, all that fall under the same cosmic epoch that we call the universe, with each society persisting for its own time until eventually falling into decay with the passing of its environment. The machinery of which is the intent towards satisfaction, where, as they move towards chaos, its intensity decreases. Or alternatively, as societies become more complex and structured, this same intensity is that which is increased, an act that requires a society to enhance its, quote, mental pole, being the mental side of the actuality's bipolar nature mentioned at the top. Quote, in this way, intensity is mated with survival, end quote. Each actual occasion is therefore shaped both by a mental and physical pole, with the act of the mental pole being twofold, where first, in order to survive, it will block any unwelcome or unnecessary detail, simplifying its world to a manageable stream of experience, and thus encouraging objectification. Hence, the objectification of the world would be, in essence, an act of abstraction, caused by the ignoring of banal information, what Whitehead calls negative prehensions. So like with our creature in the infinite desert, this would suggest that the reality we experience is not that which is interpreted by the brain, but filtered by it. An idea that has led many Whiteheadians to consider the possibility that we may have access to a depth of experience far greater than what we assume, and that it is these depths that we access during extreme mental states, like dream states, near death, the psychedelic experience, or meditation. But higher organisms don't only dismiss data into the negative, they also move towards the positive prehensions of original creativity. And indeed, it is this same move towards mental originality that manifests in us as life, and which ultimately gives rise to Whitehead's consequent nature of God. Though beyond the culmination of these mental actualities, did Whitehead also suggest a non-conscious side of God in his primordial nature, the realm of the unreachable, eternal objects that lie outside of space and time, like our perfect circle or Plato's forms?
And in a nutshell, that's it, top to tail. A bit to take on in one hit, I know, but as abstract and far-fetched as Whitehead's model may appear after such a short introduction, I do nevertheless find it intriguing how many of the surrounding elements of his thinking resonate with much of what we've laid out ourselves, such as his borderless interplay of happenings and the resultant array of perspectives, or how, once we appreciate that all is connected, our tendency to divide each attribute from its next is revealed as an act of abstraction, driven solely by a first-person perspective. Or perhaps the most striking is his concept of negative prehensions and their resonance with our claim that consciousness has emerged via an act of missing, in that it is only through ignored infinities that we acquire finite perspective. But the main takeaway, I think, should be found in his attempt to yet again reorientate our line of inquiry. As with the panpsychists, the process philosophers also strive to shed light on our more widely accepted lines of inquiry, and so too do they identify those aspects of our thinking which can prove to be unjustifiably pre-decided. For there is simply no indisputable evidence that we are, in fact, objects with a mind, and not, instead, happenings that evoke an experience of being, where what a thing is instead the process by which it becomes. But the reoccurring idea that we must now return to is that these are both unique interpretations of the same whole. They are both finite descriptions attempting to describe a deeper reality. Therefore, there is no reason why they could not both support some element of truth. For it's just as likely that we are both a being and a becoming all at once, a superposition of what we call identity. This very idea was summed up by yet another deep thinker of the time, physicist and philosopher David Bohm, who stated, quote, "The more views we can get, the deeper our understanding of the reality there is. The essence, or what I call the true being, we can never get a hold of. Every view is limited. It's like a mirror, looking this way or that. Theories don't give a final, true knowledge, they give a way of looking at something. The very word theoria in Greek means theatre, so it is the theatre of the mind which gives insight into the thing." End quote. And so, whilst identifying and appreciating this fact that we can never fully know of any ultimate nature, we can, however, start to stockpile our knowledge by gaining an understanding of this wider collection of conflicting perspectives. So what exactly have we stockpiled thus far? As a result of our scientific and now also philosophical perspective of this underlying flux and its relationship to consciousness. What are the attributes that both languages seem to share? Well, firstly, there is their shared trait of interconnectedness. Ultimately, all things must influence all things, as nothing is set apart from the whole. Secondly, within the flux of the interconnected whole, there appear to be various waves of influence, whether that be defined by the will of the universe, the aim of the actual entity, or the ever-present universal laws. There is always a universal push towards some creative intention. But here again, our interpretations have unfolded a dual description of both being and becoming, a oneness and a happening. And so, in my mind, where consciousness appears to participate is amid those aspects that are defined by the becoming of beings, as in the evolving identities, be that our own or some other. For this is the perspective won by consciousness, the unique perspective of reality that consciousness gains its unique access. And further to my way of thinking, this is also why mathematics works as efficiently as it does in the world we encounter, as it is a language that defines the nature of beings and their relationships, a language defined by the digital, whereas the perspective defined by the being of becoming is that which we grant to the flux as a whole, from which all finite perspectives must emerge, and hence through which consciousness must also persist, and also the domain where the language of mathematics finds its limitation in the unknowable attributes of the analog and infinity. But as this suggests, consciousness cannot be considered separate from or unique to either realm, as it is defined equally by both, in that it is a nexus of becomings, defined by the experience of the many unique beings, whilst its own state of being emerges from the flux, allowing it to play its part in the becoming of the whole. Consciousness is the nexus through which the analog evokes the digital, through which the infinite evokes the finite. And yet, it is also the nexus through which the finite can influence the infinite, and the digital can experience the analog. But again, as with our first descriptions of the infinite largeness and the infinite smallness, these are not two separate realities. Once again, they are the exact same space, only viewed through different eyes. But this isn't modern science. It's not even modern philosophy. What we have essentially described is one of the most ancient ideas ever to be written down. An idea that has been the central theme of countless religions across the long history of civilization. The Hindu philosophy, for one, describes this very same idea as Brahman, the highest universal principle, which is the binding unity behind all diversity. And in ancient Egyptian theology, the mathematical metaphors that underlie the Eye of Horus are directly representative of the schism that splits the infinite wholeness into a perspective of individuality. The Taoist philosophy of the yin-yang describes a reality which is both at once a relationship of opposites, whilst also being a single, unified whole. And even the Christian teachings describe the unity attained through being one with God. John 14:20. In that day you will know that I am in my Father, as you in me and I in you. John 19:67. I am He, as you are He, as you are me, and we are all together. Gugu Gujub. So here, we must acknowledge that we have allowed ourselves to be swept up by the current of inquiry and torn by its undertow into the deep waters of philosophy. And though, whilst finding them to be just as rich and plentiful in insight as those now far distant shorelines of scientific understanding, we do now need to justify the returning tall tales of the deep and try to give some clarity to those more fanciful descriptions of silhouetted figures said to be moving about the murky ocean floor. After all, what was it about the scientific revelations of the early 20th century that reignited such a fervent metaphysical interpretation of the world anyway? And does a deeper understanding of our 21st century science debunk or reinforce this new take on consciousness as the nexus between a being and becoming of reality?